Okay, so today's topic is Wilhelm Furtwängler, Nazi or hero, and at the end I'll explain why this topic is of particular interest to me. But it's a fascinating question, and how this conductor continued to stay in Nazi Germany during World War II and conducted many important concerts, including some when Hitler was present. And yet he tried he hated Nazism. He tried to help Jews whenever he could. And how do we judge a person like that? So I'll start by giving some background of Furtwängler was born in 1886, and he actually, his grandmother lived in the city of Mannheim, and he met a family by the name of Geismar, and became very friendly with their daughter, Berta, who became his secretary and business manager until she had to flee in 1935 from the Nazis and spent the war years in London. And even then, he corresponded with her and talked to her all the time. So when 1932, right before Hitler came into power, he said about Hitler, "This hissing street peddler will never get anywhere in Germany." Then, 1933, he wrote a letter to denounce the policy, anti-Semitic policy, where he started off by saying, those Jews who are not good artists, he uses the word, I think, ruthless and destructive. If you want to come down on them, okay. But, he says, if, however, this campaign is also directed at truly great artists, then it ceases to be the interest of Germany's cultural life. It must therefore be stated that men such as Walter, Klemperer, Reinhardt, etc., must be allowed to exercise their talents in Germany in the future as well, in exactly the same way as Chrysler, Huberman, Schnabel, and other great instrumentalists of the Jewish race. So he's saying that the Jews who can't be discriminated against, if they're great musicians, then they should be honored as such. Now, particularly, you'll note the name Walter, Bruno Walter. It's going to come up later, but Bruno Walter was another prominent conductor in Germany. In 1933, he was dismissed from his position as principal conductor of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra because he was Jewish, and he fled to Austria and conducted concerts there. And then they had to get somebody else to replace him, so they asked Furtwängler to replace him, and he refused because he felt that it was wrong to have dismissed Walter, and he didn't want to be put in the place where he was replacing him, which is also very, very interesting. And then Furtwängler never joined the Nazi party. He refused to give the Nazi salute. Even there were some situations where he was part of a big group. Everybody gave the Nazi salute, and he refused. He refused to sign letters, Heil Hitler, even though that was a standard procedure. Everyone who wrote a letter to Hitler was expected to write Heil Hitler, but he refused to do that. When he conducted concerts during the Nazi era, every concert was supposed to be preceded by a Nazi anthem called Horst Wessel Lied, and he refused to conduct that. So what would happen would be that some other person would be, he wouldn't be in the hall when this thing was being played, and they'd get somebody else to conduct it, and he would come in afterwards and start conducting the main work. fact, says, in fact, he refused to sign the letters. Heil Hitler was considered a major affront by the Nazi leadership. For a while, he also refused to conduct performances in a hall that was adorned with swastikas. Now, he did, in the end, conduct some such performances, but he didn't like to do that either. Yes, there was a exposition held in Paris in 1937. A picture of a German delegation was taken in front of Arc de Triomphe. In the picture, Furtwängler is the only German not giving the Nazi salute. He had a private telephone line where he talked regularly to this Bertha Geismar during the war. The Germans knew that Furtwängler was an internationally renowned conductor, and therefore they wanted to keep him in Germany, just to give prestige to their regime. And so he got a lot of privileges, despite the fact that he refused to do a lot of these things. In 1935, he was asked to conduct he conducted a concert in Berlin Philharmonic in a program dedicated to Beethoven. And then he was informed that Hitler would be attending the concert. And he was given the order to welcome Hitler with a Nazi salute. So it says, Furtwängler was so furious, he ripped the wooden paneling off a radiator. And then, when he entered the hall, all Nazi leaders were present making the Hitler salute, but Furtwängler kept hold of his baton and began the concert immediately. And in other words, just in the presence of Hitler, he just ignores him and it just starts with the concert. He tried to in the 1930s, he included Jewish and non-Aryan musicians during his overseas tours. An interesting story is recorded here. There was a meeting between Hitler and Furtwängler at the home of the daughter of Wagner, Richard Wagner, who was a renowned composer, who was, many people feel, was anti-Semitic. And he had, though, a granddaughter, Friedlin Wagner, who was anti-Nazi. And she witnessed a meeting between Hitler and Furtwängler at her mother's home. And it said, I remember Hitler turning to Furtwängler and telling him that he would now have to allow himself to be used by the party for propaganda purposes. And I remember that Furtwängler refused categorically. Hitler flew into a fury and told Furtwängler that in that case there would be a concentration camp ready for him. Furtwängler quietly replied, in that case, Herr Reichskanzler, at least I will be in very good company. Hitler couldn't even answer and vanished from the room. So he had a dispute with Arturo Toscanini, who very much opposed him because he stayed in Germany. And Furtwängler explained that you imply that art and music are merely propaganda as a false front. If a Nazi government is in power, then as a conductor, I'm a Nazi. Under the communists, I would be a communist. Under the Democrats, a Democrat. No, 1,000 times no. Music belongs to a different world and is above chance political events. In other words, he was saying he's first a musician. And he also had great admiration for Germany, not the Nazi Germany, but the historical Germany, German art, German culture, which he felt the Nazis were not part of. But he wanted to retain the historical German art and culture and believed it was his homeland. So he did not flee Germany like many of the artists did, and continued to conduct under these circumstances. And I just mentioned a few instances how he even conducted in Hitler's presence. Uh, so he another interesting thing that happened was the Nazi leadership invited Furtwängler in 1938 to conduct the Meistersinger of Nuremberg with the Vienna Philharmonic in Nuremberg for the Nazi Party Congress. Furtwängler accepted to conduct as long as the performance was not during the Party Congress. The concert took place on September the 5th, and the event was formally opened the following morning. So he was able to say, I'm not part of this Congress. In 1942, he conducted a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with the Berlin Philharmonic for Hitler's birthday. Now, it appears that he really did not want to do this, and he accepted another engagement to conduct in Vienna during that time, just to get out of this. But the Nazis had that concert canceled, and so he sort of was forced into it, and he did perform this, and at the end, Goebbels, who was the Nazi propaganda officer, came to the front of the stage, shake Furtwängler's hand, and the final minutes of his performance were filmed. I have to watch it, but apparently it can be seen today on YouTube. And that's been the basis of a lot of criticism of Furtwängler after the war. How could he do something like that? And he continued to use his influence to help Jewish musicians escape Nazi Germany. In fact, Goebbels wrote, again, this is the guy who was one of the leading Nazi officers. Furtwängler has never been a National Socialist, nor has he made any bones about it, which Jews and immigrants thought was sufficient to consider him one of them, the key representative in them. Okay. He based also, apparently the resistance, the ones who were opposed to Hitler, used to use Furtwängler's concerts as an occasion to get together and try to support each other and maybe do some plotting against Hitler. And it even seems there was a plot to kill Hitler in July 1944. And Furtwängler said he knew about the plot. He didn't participate in it, but he knew about it. Okay, so the war ended. Now what? So one thing that's interesting, February 1946, didn't mention one other point. In January 1945, it stated that Furtwängler was in a few hours of being arrested by the Gestapo. At that point, they were beginning to lose the war, and they had even stronger policies against anyone who opposed the Nazis. So he fled to Switzerland. So after the war, 1946, Furtwängler met in Vienna a German Jew by the name of Kurt Ries, who had fled Germany in 1933. The latter was a musician and writer. He later wrote a book on Furtwängler. He thought that Furtwängler was a Nazi collaborator and objected to having Furtwängler directing in Switzerland in 1945. Furtwängler asked to meet him, and when Ries had studied all the documents concerning Furtwängler, he completely changed his mind. Realizing that Furtwängler had never been a Nazi and helped many people of Jewish origin, he became his denazification advisor. And he spent the next 2 years doing whatever he could to get Furtwängler exonerated. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to another aspect of this, Bruno Walter. And so I gave out, there's a copy of that. A sheet where I quote two things. Bruno Walter was another very famous conductor. Bruno Walter was born Jewish. In fact, his name was Bruno Schlesinger. And it's not entirely clear why he changed his name, but probably because he thought it was too Jewish sounding and he did Bruno Walter. Of course, for the Nazis, the fact that you renounce Judaism made no difference. He converted to Christianity, but in the eyes of the Nazis, he was still a Jew. And in 1933, he was forced to leave Germany. I just mentioned that before, where he was scheduled to conduct this concert, and he was warned there's going to be violence if you conduct the concert. So he left Germany and went to Austria and conducted a concert in Austria under great acclaim. Of course, Austria, as we all know, became part of Nazi Germany later, but in 1933 it wasn't, and he could safely go there. And then he came to the United States and became a very well-renowned conductor in the United States. He was a conductor, music director of New York Philharmonic for some period of time. And then in 1946, Fort Wrangler, who had known Bruno Walter, wrote him a letter and asking him, could he help him after the war to get conducting positions in the United States? And Bruno Walter wrote back, at refusing to do that, and he writes, please bear in mind that your art was used over the years as an extremely effective means of foreign propaganda for the regime of the devil. That you, thanks to your personal fame and great talent, perform valuable service for this regime, and that in Germany itself, your presence of activities and artists of your rank helped to provide culture and moral credit to those terrible criminals, or at least gave considerable help to them. In contrast to that, of what significance was your helpful behavior in individual cases of Jewish distress? So you can see here that he was not supportive of Fort Wrangler. And then there's another thing that he wrote in January 1949. Now, this is a different context. This was written to a fellow conductor. In 1949, Fort Wrangler was offered the position of a conductor at the Chicago Symphony, and he was going to conduct a series of concerts here. So this conductor writes to Bruno Walter saying, if Fort Wrangler comes to Chicago, I'm scheduled to conduct performances after him. Can I go there? Can I conduct? Or maybe he has contaminated the place. If he appears there, then I can't conduct afterwards. So clearly the context is different. One could certainly say Fort Wrangler is a bad person. He helped the Nazis, but okay, he conducted there. You can still go and conduct afterwards. But so Bruno Walter writes back a letter saying that yes, it's okay to go, but the tone of the letter is just completely different. My friend, I highly appreciate your feeling of friendship with your confidential letter just arrived at Brett. And I should also add, say confidential letter. This whole thing was considered confidential. And as a result, the letter that Bruno Walter wrote, I'll see if it's here, if I can find it, was, here it is. It was handwritten. This is a copy of the letter in the original handwriting. It's available online. That's what it's in a file with all the his other correspondence of his time. Every other letter is typed. This one is handwritten, which itself says something. So then he continues, if we, the world would be condemned to a sterile condition of deadlock if we all should perpetuate the feeling of condemnation and the attitude of collective treatment of each and every one who was ever, I left out the word ever, connected with the Nazis. Condemnation of the real Nazi is an expression of elementary decency and of a human heart, but we should try to be just and differentiate. And then he continues, Fort Wrangler has never been my friend. He is a weak person, ambitious, jealous, egocentric, but he is no Nazi. Tried his best to help Jews in their need, saved one, Dr. Strelitzer, from the concentration camp. And he certainly cannot be considered to be a moral leader who infects with the poison of his behavior and the character the conductor stands so thoroughly. And weeks after his performance, the virus makes it impossible for another conductor to step to that stand. Now, granted, the context was different, but the tone of his letter is so completely different than what he had written 3 years earlier. 3 years earlier, about, oh, in contrast to that, what significance would your helpful behavior in individual cases of Jewish distress? And here he says, tried his best to help Jews in their need, save one Dr. Strelitzer from the concentration camp. So what happened? I should also add, last night I just found a book written about what Bruno Walter online, and it points out in 1946, Bruno Walter was asked to conduct at a certain festival, and he said, if Furtwängler goes there, I'm not going to conduct. So and also I can, looking at this book again, there was a personal animosity between the two conductors. I'm not sure exactly why, and I know that Bruno Walter did not like Furtwängler. I'm not sure that the reverse was the case. As I mentioned earlier, Furtwängler singles out Bruno Walter as being one of the Jewish musicians that must be allowed to stay. And when Bruno Walter left, he refused to assume the conducting position for that concert. But in any event, the two of them apparently did not get along. But now, so why did he suddenly change his position? And I think the clue is in that thing, it's in parentheses, Dr. Strelitzer. Now, who was Dr. Strelitzer? Dr. Hugo Strelitzer was a German Jew who was a conductor. I didn't quite have the same fame as Bruno Walter or Furtwängler or Toscanini, but he was a well-known conductor of opera. And in 1933, he was in Germany, and because he was Jewish, he was arrested by the Gestapo and thrown in jail. And he had no idea what to do. And his friends contacted Furtwängler. Apparently, the two of them didn't know each other. But Furtwängler, hearing that this Jewish musician was thrown in jail, pulled some string and got him out of jail. And afterwards, he came to the United States, had this very successful career in the United States. He felt so strongly about what happened. He said, I owe my life to Furtwängler. After the war, Furtwängler was put on trial for being a Nazi. He went to Germany. He made a special trip to Germany to testify in Furtwängler's favor. And he was acquitted. Now, I should say that I think everybody knew at the time that whatever Furtwängler had done, he was no Nazi, and he tried to do, he tried to resist whatever he could. He was, of course, acquitted. But the fact that Dr. Strelitzer took the trouble to go to Germany to testify in his favor shows how strongly he felt in favor of Furtwängler. And then, in July 1947, Strelitzer and Bruno Walter jointly conducted a performance at the Hollywood Bowl. Now, I wasn't there, of course. I don't know what they said to each other, but I can only guess, and I'm quite sure, that Strelitzer used the opportunity to talk to Bruno Walter about how Furtwängler had saved his life. And Bruno Walter never forgot that. And the difference is, yes, he had heard that Furtwängler saved Jews, but here, he was a live person that he met who had told him about what Furtwängler had done, and that made an impression. It's interesting that it says he saved one from the concentration camp in this letter. Actually, according to what I've read, Furtwängler saved at least 80 people, most of whom were Jewish. But he mentions one. And to me, that implies that it was this encounter with Dr. Strelitzer that changed his mind. That he realized that you actually encounter somebody whose life was saved by the action of this person. It can really change your attitude. And then let me end by mentioning, why am I interested in this? Why did I go into all this and do all this research? I love classical music, and my parents had a subscription to the New York Philharmonic, which started about 70 years ago. And I've been going to concerts, probably for the last, certainly over 50 years. And I guess some of you probably have been to what was then known as Philharmonic Hall, Avery Fisher Hall, Lincoln Center. And we had tickets as a subscription to the first tier, right side. And when you walked in there was an exhibit, and the exhibit was entitled "The Politics of Choosing a Conductor." And it related to the fact in 1935, sometime around then, the New York Philharmonic offered Wilhelm Furtwängler a position, guest conductor of New York Philharmonic. I know maybe it was music director, whatever. I think it was music director of New York Philharmonic. And there was a whole storm of protest. They had an exhibit, a letter that was written by Reverend, forget the last name, but Kaufman, some obviously Jewish name, where this guy writes, "How dare you extend an offer to Furtwängler to conduct? If you do this, I'm going to cancel my subscription, and I'm going to tell all my friends to do so." And they obviously received quite a few letters of that nature, because Furtwängler had a reputation of being a Nazi coming from Germany. Then they post the minutes of the meeting of the board of the New York Philharmonic. And the minutes say, "This meeting is confidential. We only made 10 copies of these minutes, and we got to keep it completely confidential." And in it, they discuss the pros and cons. And basically what they say is, yeah, we made the right decision. Furtwängler is a great conductor, but we have a lot of Jews as subscribers. They're like half of our subscribers. And then one of them says, "Well, I'm not Jewish, but if I were Jewish, how would I feel about it?" And in the end, they withdrew the invitation. Then there's a article in the New York Times. They have a picture of this article where Bruno Walter was kicked out of Germany, and he went to Austria, and he conducted the Vienna Philharmonic to great acclaim. And then they have the letter that I just read, the letter of 1949, where he says, "Furtwängler never been my friend, but he is no Nazi." And they have the original letter, which is readable. I mean, if you looked at it carefully, you can. But they also had a transcription. And the transcription, where it said, "Try his best to help Jews in their need, save one from the concentration camp," they omitted the name of Dr. Strelitz. And that, it must have been up there for like 50 years, that letter and the whole exhibit. And I used to read it every time I went there, and I said, wow, what do we learn from this? We learned that clearly Furtwängler was not a Nazi. The people in 1935, the Jews in New York, didn't know they were talking about. Bruno Walter, who did know him, concludes he's not a Nazi. And even those words, "He's never been my friend, he's ambitious, jealous, egocentric," if he can say that and then say, "Oh, but he's not a Nazi," that means even more that he's not a Nazi. So clearly those people were wrong. Yes, but at that time I was not aware of this other letter in 1946, where he says, "You were extremely effective means of foreign propaganda for the regime of the devil." And so it's clear that what was exhibited in the New York Philharmonic did not give a full picture of what was going on. And how could they put up an exhibit like that, which was really not the full story? And I assume that they had found this letter in the archives of the Philharmonic, but they weren't even aware of the other letter. It's also true, by the way, that Furtwängler and Bruno Walter did have some kind of reconciliation. I just discovered last night in this book that I copied a few pages from, that they met in 1950. There's a picture of both of them taken in 1950. So they at least were talking to each other in 1950. But it's just a very interesting study. How do we deal with somebody like this, who stayed in Germany, inducted in the presence of Hitler, even shook Hitler's hand at these concerts, and there is no question that his conducting during the Nazi era did give prestige to Nazi Germany. But on the other hand, he was very much personally opposed to their policy, and he apparently saved the lives of 80 Jews because of his influence with the Nazis. So where do you, I would, I'll end the thing by saying that if Fort Langer were alive today, of course he's not, he died in 1954, but if he were alive today and he gave a concert in New York, I would make a point of attending the concert. Because I think that, I'm not sure I would have done what he did if I was in his position, but I respect what he did and certainly think that he tried to do whatever he could to oppose the Nazis, yet help the Jews. Okay. Let me turn this thing off.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Hope you enjoyed it.
Very interesting.
Yeah. We have Zoom, I guess. Rabbi Barech. Yishem Abdullah, Shus Chaverai, Bresha Chol Mishalo. Rosh Hashanah Shabbat Tovachinu.